You can say it's a choice. It's a choice.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you guys.
I-
Have a good one.
Okay,
All right. So
same rule for
the organizers, I guess. This is Startups in Africa. Is joint work with Emanuele, Marcia, Mariana, who are here, somewhere in the room. So we have talked about it already, yesterday. The African continent is not only about agricultural employment or employment into small, low productivity firms, but there is, a small right now group of digital entrepreneurs, startups that are growing and that have, potentially. They could transform the continent by creating products that are widely used, that enable more growth by anyway, sorry, let me move on. Okay, I just realized I'm talking too much. Okay, so there is a big policy debate around this segment of the economy, and the question is essentially how to spur this segment and how to finance the startups. Now, the academic literature so far doesn't have much to answer to these important policy questions. Why? Because essentially we don't have the data. We have not done research on these companies. So what we do in this paper is we try to make some baby steps in the direction of answering the big policy question by building new data, okay? Building a data set on African startups. And then using this data to essentially try to understand who are these entrepreneurs and how are these companies financed. So we really do 3 steps. So the core contribution it is designing a new survey, which is continent-wide. It's done in partnership with the IFC. And we use this survey to try to understand what these companies want, the demand for capital, what type of financing these companies need, how large are the loans or equity stakes that they need. What we find out is that startups really want equity capital, which is scarce domestically, and they don't really care where this capital comes from. They don't care about the investor's identity. We then take we collect a second data set, essentially focusing on those established startups that already got equity financing. And we think of this one essentially as a data that allows us to characterize the current equilibrium capital flows. Try to see, okay, who are the successful entrepreneurs and where did they get their money from? We find out that essentially there is a big reliance on foreign input. 80% of all the capital comes from abroad, meaning outside of Africa. And the largest share of entrepreneurs either are foreigners or have studied abroad or work abroad. The last part of the paper, we do an accounting framework to kind of connect together 1 and 2 and try to understand why there is this big foreign reliance. I'll just glance through it at the end. Okay, so our survey. So what we try to do, essentially, we wanted to try to reach as many startups as possible on the continent. Here, the blue dots are where we find companies. How we did it, we essentially leveraged the partnership with the IFC, and we relied on their networks to disseminate the survey through networks of startups. Think of it as local accelerators, a mailing list, WhatsApp list, and so on and so forth. And we found roughly 8,000 startups. Of course, is this representative or not is hard to know, but this essentially captures a snapshot of all those entrepreneurs which are active within the startup network. So if you summary stats. So these founders, you have seen it yesterday, they're all college educated, and a large share of them have foreign exposure, either they studied or worked abroad. Companies are young, so the startups are young by definition, but they're growing fast. In fact, we cover we span a large chunk of the firm size distribution from 5 to 100 employees. And importantly, these are companies that do not want microcredit. They are looking for $500,000 or so, and they haven't been able to secure credit. So in the last 3 years, we ask, what's the share of credit that you managed to find? Just 20% of the required amount. Now, what do these startup entrepreneurs want? Where, which type of credits that they're looking for? Now, to answer this question in an incentive-compatible way, we essentially do this survey experiment. So to every entrepreneurs, we show a few realistic potential investor profiles, where we vary them in terms of the financing type. This is an investor that offers equity. This is an investor that offers debt. In terms of the identity of this fund and the team, some teams are domestic, some teams are foreign, so on and so forth. Then we can run a standard, empirical specification using the ranking of entrepreneurs of different profiles to try to see, okay, which characteristics of an investor profile is really valued. What we learn, essentially, startups want equity offer. Okay, so they really search for the equity rather than debt. Why? Well, plausibly because part of them are financially constrained and they all their profits are backloaded. Instead, what startups do not really care about is they do not really care about the identity of the team or the fund. They don't care whether the investors come from abroad or whether it is a local domestic investors. Turning to the second data set. So what we did here, we relied on a pitch book and a similar kind of specified data set for Africa called Africa the Big Deal to essentially identify all those startups that have received venture capital financing. Now, once we have these all these names, we then merge them with LinkedIn data, and LinkedIn is useful because it allows us essentially to see who are the founders and what are their job trajectories. By doing that, we get something like 7,000 startups, as you can see, throughout the continent. And we can use this data to essentially see where does capital come from. So this is one the main result of the paper. The blue line, it is the share of financing that comes from outside of Africa. As you can see, capital does flow to low-income countries, at least from this perspective. 80% of financing comes from outside of the region, and this is higher than other emerging markets, for example. We can ask where does it come from. A typical question we have it is, well, is this all coming from China? No, China does invest in Africa, but not to startups. Okay, mainly the money comes from Europe and North America. Turning to who are these established African entrepreneurs? You've seen this picture yesterday. They all have college educated, irrespective of which country they're in, but also many of them studied abroad. So essentially, 50% of all these successful entrepreneurs within Africa studied abroad. This number is higher than in our representative survey, because the representative survey is describes the whole activity, and this is the peak of the iceberg. So it is clearly some selection going on. Okay. Now, the last part of the paper, we essentially asked, okay, why so much foreign reliance? To do that, we write down a simple accounting framework, which I'm not going to describe today in details. Let me just show you the key equation. Essentially, we can see that the ratio between, or the share of foreign financing in a given country is going to be driven by two big blocks. The demand, so this is whether entrepreneurs demand more foreign financing, and the supply, whether there is higher supply of equity capital coming from foreigners. Each term can be unpacked. We know the preferences. It can be that maybe there is reliance on foreign financing because that is what entrepreneurs want. Our survey experiment tells us that doesn't really matter. Instead, what we find it is that connections are really important. We bring in additional empirical facts to show that. We also find that returns matter to some extent. So it seems that entrepreneurs that essentially have access to foreign financing provide higher return. But we don't have the final number, but we suspect we are going to find that the main driver is the cost of capital. So in practice, domestic equity is just very expensive, and that is why in equilibrium you see a lot of equity financing coming from abroad. So to conclude, what we are doing in this project, essentially we are just building new data on startups in Africa. We realize that there is a big reliance on foreign input, both capital and human capital, but the two things are definitely connected with one another. And why that's the case? Because local equity is expensive and scarce. We believe there are many open questions in the area. These are just some quotes from entrepreneurs and VC fund in the continent. Thank you so much. Yes. Please.
I find these results very interesting because one of the arguments is used to say that foreign capital doesn't flow to Europe. For instance, the small ticket of the investment, the high screening costs, and the fact that the supply of support from foreign investors might be low. But these are all arguments that could apply to the African setting, but they seem not to matter. And I wonder if you have.
How is it possible? So that's a great point. So it's true that of course some of this is a small ticket. Some of the things that work is the fund of fund type of structure. So capital goes in a bigger umbrella kind of fund, GPs within Africa, which then unpack it into smaller ticket. But I think it's I agree with you. This is definitely not obvious at all ex ante, right? There are many other reasons why you would expect essentially that there are information frictions that maybe foreign investors do not want to invest in Africa. But in equilibrium, that's still what we find. Yes, Francis, and then Chris.
So you said most of these guys are educated and they are likely more foreign trained.
Yeah.
How much of the capital comes from their own personal finance? Do you know?
Yeah, of course. It's like this is actually what Emily showed yesterday. A large chunk from our survey we can look at it. It's like on average roughly 50%.
So
Yes, it varies across the firm size distribution. So if you look at relatively small startups between 5 and 20, very little prevalence of VC for those companies. Most of it is self-financing or friends and family. Now, if you look at the big one, then VC starts contributing to 30 to 40%, and the self-financing part goes down to 20%. Yes, Lauren. I guess Chris. Yeah, Lauren.
I was just wondering, I'm thinking about, is this a problem and is there some misallocation? And so I'm trying to, are you thinking that it's maybe a search and screening problem where it's not going to there's differential search costs to find the right investment? Or I'm wondering also if you know what they're investing in, there's possibility there's a match between the investors have some specialty in certain types of products or markets, and that, the founders who come from that country then also kind of specialize. And that might actually be a good match rather than a kind of.
I agree. So then, is this a problem or not?
Yeah.
I do not know. Now, what we're gonna do with this essentially accounting framework is we're gonna say, okay, what drives it? Okay, and so for example, the connections matter a lot. So what does that mean? It means that since local domestic equity is very expensive, and as a result, and since we estimate that foreigners or foreign exposed individuals are more likely to get money from abroad, the prevalence on foreign capital is going to change essentially the identity of the investors, which are more likely to be people that either studied abroad or are foreigners, and of course then as a result change who captures or gathers the returns from investing. Now, is that good or bad? Is this we don't know? Okay, I think these are just facts, and then hopefully in a few years we'll try to understand. Okay, is there a misallocation or not? I was mentioning to you yesterday the capital flows also shape the type of products that companies do. And so, but again, is that just driven by the fact that if an investor has specialties in a particular topic, they're going to finance that topic, and that is actually good because that is what you want in a world with information fiction? Or is this actually misallocation of innovation? Honestly, we do not know right now. I think it's important to kind of have these facts out there so that then we can ask these follow-up questions.
But it'd be interesting to control for that and see if you still see this not home bias, but this bias based on.
You can control, you can control for for example, a strong set, sector fixed effect. Okay?
Yeah.
And you see these results are so strong that they apply within sector and so on and so forth. But that's still not enough. Yes. Actually, sorry. Okay, yeah, go ahead, guys.
We don't want you to.
Yeah, can you say we always chat with you. Yes.
I was just curious whether that was essentially part of the return on going to business school. So can you check whether those guys are within 5 years of coming out of business school, and can you check the link, the school, do they share the school with the people who are investing, or how can you.
Yeah, so we have the whole job trajectories, and it's totally true. A lot of people go abroad and then they come back, or maybe they work 2-3 years abroad and then they come back and they create a startup. So for sure, this is part of the returns of schooling. Now, we haven't done the school fixed effect, so that is actually interesting. We haven't done it, but we can in principle. I think I have to shut up. Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Ben. I'm going to talk about a paper that's also joint with Emanuele and also Tim McQuaid and Natalia Regal. And I'll get to say one more funny thing about the fact that this is also with Emanuele in a little bit. Okay, so just by sort of way of setting the stage, there's a big movement in the business world to combine profit motives with environment, social impact kinds of motives. And it goes by a lot of names, but in investing, it's often called impact investing. In the operating side, it's often called social entrepreneurship. And it's, these things don't have precise definitions, but the best estimates suggest these are really big categories. So the Global Impact Investing Network thinks that there's more than $1.5 trillion in assets under management held by impact investors worldwide. That's bigger than US venture capital. And for social entrepreneurship, the estimate is $2 trillion in revenue a year worldwide, which is bigger than US apparel. So would I hang my hat on those numbers? No, but they're big though. They're big numbers. And so if you're gonna, oh, you guys laugh fast, like one of my MBA students, I appreciate that. Okay, so if you're gonna take seriously this idea of like profits and impact, there's pretty widespread agreement that measuring impact is important, just as you'd measure profits. Okay, in fact, the impact investing, global impact investing network puts that in the definition of impact investing. So that's not so controversial, but how you measure impact, and more importantly, what are the consequences of doing that? Those I think are not well agreed upon or understood. And so the question we're after in this project is what happens to firm performance, firm growth, and capital allocation when you start to take impact measurement really, really seriously? And we're gonna find pretty big striking effects. So let me tell you how we get there. So we ran an experiment. We designed a training course, impact training course with India's largest incubator of social enterprises. They're called Build Grow. And I'll tell you about the course in a moment, but let me tell you about the students. We had 146 social enterprises split across agribusiness, energy and clean tech, health services, education, and financial inclusion. And 30% are pre-revenue, so they're in the MVP stage. 30% are in market already generating revenue, and 40% are in growth phase, which either means they're actively raising their Series A or they've raised it at some point in the past. Their average revenues were $50,000. They'd raised a little less than $100,000, and about half of that was equity financing. Okay, so what was the course? So the course happened on Zoom. It was about 13 weeks. There were 7 Zoom sessions with a bit of engagement before and afterwards. And you should think of it as the hows and whys of measuring impact in a corporate setting. Okay, so it had a few parts. Iris Plus and Acumen Lean Data, these are like the 2 most commonly applied approaches in practice, at least sort of with, from our view. Iris Plus, you should think of this as helping firms identify for their sector a handful of impact key performance indicators that are relatively standardized across the sector, and they do their best to connect them to research. So imagine you're like doing lending, and they'll tell you like, how many loans did you make? How big were the loans? What were the incomes of the people you gave loans to? Maybe measure over indebtedness or something like that. For extra credit, maybe you like talk to the customers and you track livelihood growth. And they'll do their best to connect it to research to say, like, what causal claims could you plausibly make? Like, maybe microfinance's impact on women's empowerment. It doesn't really have impact on average on livelihoods. So if you want to make claims about livelihoods, you have to measure it directly. That's the kind of engagement that happens in Iris Plus. Acumen Lean Data is really different. That one is like, design a 15-minute survey and go field that with as many customers as possible and come up with a richer qualitative story about the kinds of ways you're impacting their lives. So those are the differences. We gave them a module on communicating impact and introduced them to some software to make sort of very nice presentations for investors. And then the last thing we did, and by the way, so I would say this is like very standard. You could think of this as kind of like the gold standard impact training as it stands today. And we added one thing, which is we told them another way you can measure impact is by talking to your customers, your employees, your suppliers, if your suppliers are, smallholder farmers or micro enterprises, and measure the surplus, consumer surplus, employee surplus, and so on. So like, pros and cons of each of these, happy to engage on those. None of them is amazing, but we think they're all interesting and better than nothing.
And Ben was the treatment.
I did the consumer surplus one, and it had a big treatment effect. So, okay, so here's the study. So baseline happened in September 2022. That's when we sort of recruit the sample. The course begins in April 2023 with a little bit of pre-engagement, and everybody takes the course. So everyone got the Ben Roth effect. The special part, what's like mostly special for the treatment group, is they get a liaison with Build Grow, who helps them operationalize these things. So I think 4 or 5 one-on-one sessions where they think through like, what's your impact framework going to be? If you're fielding a survey, how would you design it? How do you field it? And so on. So that's the bulk of the treatment. We also had sector-specific WhatsApp groups for the treatment to sort of communicate about best practices within their sector. And for customer surplus, we actually fielded a survey. So we did this for the treatment groups. We had them give us information about their customers, who, through all the IRB and whatever. And we measured customer surplus, and we gave them like a nice presentation that they could share with investors. That happened in October of 2023. We did it also with the control group in May of 2024, thinking we might be able to look for treatment effects. That's been pretty noisy, so we're not going to tell you anything about it today. We're still hoping maybe something will emerge, but nothing has. And then the end line is in July of 2024. All right, so here are the results, and they're pretty big. Let me give you a sense of how to read this. So these are difference in difference specifications. The even columns have investor fixed effects. And the standard errors are traditional standard errors clustered at the firm level, but the stars come from clustered wild bootstrap. So it has good finite sample properties. It's a bit more conservative in our setting because we have only 146 firms. What do you see? You see that for the control group, revenues rose by about $26,000 per year. That was nearly doubled for the treatment group. And when you look at the capital raised, that was about $30,000 in the control group, and again, nearly doubled. And so those are huge effects. That surprised us. We weren't expecting effects this large. And again, confidence intervals are broad. We can be confident this is not zero, but it may not be a true doubling. Okay, but what are the mechanisms we think are at play? One is at its core, at least two, if not three, of the impact metrics we trained in are about going and talking to your customers and figuring out what are the things you're doing that they find valuable, what could you do that they find even more valuable, and who's your sort of the customers that you're serving the best, basically. And at Harvard Business School, we've been teaching people to do that for the 100+ years of its existence, not in the impact training course. That the course hasn't existed until Natalia and I joined, but in the marketing course, right? So that's like tried and true method of refining early stage business models and stuff like that. So that's one mechanism we think is at play. The other is that investors like this stuff. Okay, and so there may be a sort of direct treatment effect of giving investors a way to communicate about your impact, and then those things obviously have feedback in each direction. So if you have more early stage revenue growth, that's good for raising capital. If you raise capital, it's good for revenue growth. All right, so I have 29 seconds. We did a whole extra thing that I haven't budgeted time to tell you about, but I'll blast through it. We recruited some professional investors. We showed them profiles that look comically like the ones that Tommaso showed you. So I guess Emanuele has been reusing the code base, but we had them look at, assess hypothetical startup profiles in an incentivized way. And we confirmed that for these professional investors, all of whom are active in India, they care a lot about consumer surplus. So we randomized, do we show you this consumer surplus information as a measure of how impactful the firm is? And they're very, very responsive when you show that. So investors seem to care about this. We're actively collecting more investors. So if you have ideas for interesting things to do with them, we could implement that in real time. I'm done. Thank you.
They're thinking about the consumer surplus as a way to impact and to give to the consumer, or they're thinking, wow, this is a place where we can discriminate and get that surplus and it will be profitable.
Okay. I love that question. I think everyone probably heard it, but when I sit in the back, I can't hear the question. So I'm going to repeat your question. Customer surplus, we can all agree that looks like a measure of impact, but also, could you imagine that being a tool for price discrimination, basically? And let me expand on that. It could be the firm that might use this for price discrimination. It could also be investors that push you to use this information for price discrimination. We think that's fascinating. We have a little bit of data on firm pricing, although it came from that customer surplus exercise that I mentioned was quite noisy. So we don't see evidence of firms raising their prices in response to this. We don't know whether investors would want to raise prices, but that's actually one avenue that we've just been brainstorming about. Might be really fun to explore on the investor survey of, do you imagine any investors, whether they're impact investors or traditional investors, that would be inclined to use this information? Does that create conflicts of interest at the cap table? I love the question. Chris.
So I guess if I was an investor, I'd care who the consumers are, not just what the consumer surplus is.
Yeah.
How do you frame who the consumers are and whether, and even in the training?
Yeah. So we treat that's important. So, in the lecture I gave on how to measure customer surplus, we treat as very first order, are you reaching poor customers? We collect data on that. When they're the ones collecting data, we encourage them to collect data on that. I don't remember offhand. I think surely we also randomized that in this exercise. I don't remember on this slide. I haven't included that regression, so I don't know if investors are responsive to that or not. But it is known. Do you know?
No, but we can look at it.
We can figure it out.
Qualification, do they get a certificate saying that they've been trained by Ben Roth?
So we're, believe it or not, so being a faculty at Harvard Business School, they were not trained by Harvard Business School. That's critically important. They were trained by a professor from Harvard Business School, and I think surely they did get some kind of Bill Gross certificate that mentioned this thing exists. So that also could be, the control group also gets that, but could be,
And in
related.
the ratings, in this exercise, can you tease that out? Did you vary whether there is a certificate or not? And
We did not. So we varied two things. One is we came up with like a non-quantitative sentence about, or several sentences that tried to articulate what was the impact thesis. We wrote that set of sentences, but we wrote it from their website and the survey materials. That was like our proxy for how would impact be communicated without quantitative metrics. And that did nothing. Consumer surplus did a lot. We did not randomize, did you get the Harvard Business School Bill Growth certificate?
Quick clarification, what does the pool of capital look like for these firms? Like basically, is this an experiment where you should think that maybe SIPA is violated or not? Like, is this
that's
like
okay.
displacement? Or?
I liked your question until you asked the SIPA thing. So I forgot to repeat questions. So what does the pool of capital look like? Where is money coming from? And could SIPA be violated? I know a lot about where they get their money from. I don't know the identities of the investors. So about half of the capital they've raised is equity financing. I believe all of the treatment effect that I showed you, that was just equity financing. 85% sure that's true. And could they be competing with one another for financing? That's a good question. I hope not, and we'll dig in. Yeah. Maybe like less scary questions than that. Yeah.
If you want to make it about measurement, shouldn't you have like a control group where one you ask them to write down, go and talk to your customer, and then one treatment arm should be write it down or whatever measurement mean, and the other one should be not.
I think let's take a longer conversation offline. That would be also an experiment. The experiment we did is to give people a lot of support in executing on these different kinds of impact metrics, which I think is, another way to try to understand are impact metrics important for operations? We didn't do your experiment, but I'd be happy to chat about sort of where the differences lie. All right, Dean, go ahead.
Anything resembling the truth underlying, or is it just to know whether there's differential effects for ones that are actually, more true to the spirit of social impact versus ones that are just using it?
So the closest thing we have to the underlying truth is our measure of customer surplus, employee surplus, and supplier surplus. We haven't explored that kind of heterogeneity. So that's interesting. I think we'll not be able to do that full justice, but we can certainly explore along those. I'm seeing red numbers, so guys, thank you so much.
All right, thank you for having me. This is joint with Carlos Borga and Adrian Matrai. And as you know, we have a wealth of evidence on the partial equilibrium effects of microfinance, which generally finds positive but not transformative effects. Evidence at scale is much scarcer, but one notable exception is Emily and Cynthia's work showing that halting microfinance activities has meaningful wage and consumption impacts. But to the extent that microfinance institutions are limited in their ability to promote growth, they may be limited by different channels. For instance, it could be their lending technology. The first generation of MFIs almost exclusively provided small unsecured loans, and maybe small loans is just not enough to lift people out of poverty. But maybe it's not about how MFIs lend, but rather the borrowers that they serve, right? So maybe there's only so much that any financial institution can do when would-be borrowers don't have assets they can pledge as collateral. These two things are hard to disentangle in practice because MFIs are typically operating in poor areas where small businesses have limited assets to pledge. And this is a question where scale is important because equilibrium effects can matter here. So maybe a small number of small loans doesn't do much, but if you make enough of them in the same place, maybe you could crowd in bank lending. So this project is about how the at-scale expansion of MFIs impacts economic growth. And I'm talking about a sharp expansion across both areas not served by any financial institution. I'm going to be calling them financial deserts, but also banked districts. And we're going to study these two types of places separately because we think they teach us different things. By observing MFI's decisions to enter into financial deserts and serve customers that banks will not, we're learning about how their lending technology differs. And by looking at bank districts where banks have found it profitable to locate and where they do extend larger secured loans, we learned about whether MFIs can do the same when facing borrowers that do have assets to pledge. These are the only two questions I'm going to be able to answer for you today. And in both cases, the answer is yes. They do choose to go where banks will not. But when they enter banked districts, they do offer larger secured loans. We care about a lot more than that, though. We want to understand whether MFIs help small businesses upgrades into other forms of financing and whether this matters for growth. So for instance, is microfinance a stepping stone for these entrepreneurs getting small unsecured loans, which in our data is almost exclusively consumption loans, to eventually getting a secured business loan? Or do MFIs crowd in bank lending by helping entrepreneurs eventually qualify for a bank loan? And does any of this matter for long-term investment and wage growth? So our setting is going to be a marked deregulation episode in Peru in 2005. Before 2005, MFIs could not operate in multiple regions. By regions, I mean departamentos. There are 25 of them in Peru. After 2005, MFIs are allowed to expand beyond the region where they're headquartered. This created a rather cumbersome approval process, but the process was streamlined for MFIs with an A credit rating. Those MFIs, which happened to be the largest ones, didn't have to ask for permission. They could just notify the government of where they were opening. And the result was a strong expansion of these MFIs. The red line in this plot is showing you the share of districts without a bank. And you can see that this is fairly stable during this period, hovering between 92 and 93%. So banks were not expanding around this time, which is reassuring, but MFIs do start expanding after 2005. The blue dashed line is the share of districts without any financial institution, microfinance or otherwise. And you can see this starts dropping sharply after deregulation. This is driven by these 10 largest MFIs. So to study this deregulation, we're going to link different sources of administrative records. We have branch level data. This will give us the location of both MFIs and banks, as well as branch level lending and deposits. We also have credit records of small business owners. This will tell us any loans that they have and whether the loan is by a bank or MFI, secured or unsecured, business or consumption. We also have tax records with info on stuff like sales and assets and payroll, and also a household survey, which as of now we're mostly using for proxies of informality. Our empirical strategy is to predict the entry of MFIs based on the distance of each district to where an MFI is headquartered. Okay, so this map is flagging for you in red the provinces where the largest MFIs were headquartered before 2005. And you can see that they weren't very clustered in space. We're going to estimate effects separately for financial deserts and banked areas. And of course, these places are very different. But financial deserts that are close to an MFI headquarters are very similar to those that are further away. And the same is true within banked areas. So within deserts and within banked areas, districts that are near versus far from an MFI are balanced on observables, and they were on parallel trends before 2005. Okay, so what have we learned so far? Not that much just yet. So I only have a first stage to tell you about today, meaning the entry and lending behavior of MFIs. MFIs do choose to enter financial deserts. And I really mean choose here because they were not being subsidized or otherwise incentivized to move into those areas, but rather they were allowed to. And this is a somewhat unique feature of the Peruvian context where these largest MFIs are profit maximizing institutions. They have similar ROAs as the banks. So the fact that they're choosing to go and serve the customers banks will not tells us that they have a different lending technology than banks. When they do enter these areas though, they only offer small unsecured consumption loans. But they also enter bank districts and there they behave differently. There they extend both unsecured consumption loans, but also secured business loans. For our next steps, we want to think about the real effects and whether MFIs help financial deserts catch up to more developed areas. And we also want to learn more about how these MFIs operate and whether this matters for growth. For instance, when they enter bank districts, are they competing for the same set of customers, or are they serving a different segment of the market? And if they're serving a different segment, are they helping these business owners eventually qualify for a bank loan? And does the product mix matter at all beyond the amount of credit being extended? What I mean is money is fungible. So does it matter that these business owners are getting unsecured consumption loan versus secured business loans? That is to be determined. Thank you, and I look forward to your.
I believe you, but there's a missing step when you're saying the fact that they choose to enter means that they have a different lending technology. Because if you need a license to be a bank, if it's restricted, if there's a couple of big banks and they just divided the area, then you may just be increasing competition with the same type of product. No?
I think competition is an important other kind of force at play. Also for the fact of, is it collateral or is it the lending technology? And we're looking into that in terms of like literally the regulation. What this did was bring MFIs closer to banks, not push them further, right? So we used to be restricting their ability to enter into these places, and now we put fewer restrictions, making them more similar to banks. But I do acknowledge that competition could be an important part of this as well.
Picking up on this point about MFIs potentially being a stepping stone and crowding in bank loans, we do have some evidence from other contexts that happens. Ben has a paper on this. There's a paper in Rwanda by Agarwal and Presbytero and others. I've always wondered whether there's also in equilibrium, can this potentially make the MFI's business model unsustainable? So imagine that the MFIs have to pay, these are people without any formal financial history. The MFI comes in, they have to pay a high cost to initially figure out who the good borrowers are because they have no formal financial history. And maybe that's only profitable for them if they can then repeat lend to those same borrowers and recoup the costs. And so it would make sense under that model that they're going into the areas where banks aren't, because that's where they can potentially repeat lend, but that could be a potential kind of equilibrium effect. If there is this crowding in of bank loans, then all of a sudden does it make the MFI model unsustainable in those areas? Is there any way you can look into?
I agree completely with that, and the equilibrium forces are part of why we like this experiment and we like its scale. In terms of, I want to flag that they're actually doing both, right? They're both going in and entering the bank districts and going into these other areas. But I agree with you on the competition. There's like also a nice paper on this in Brazil. Gustavo Joaquim kind of shows that that can actually, like the competition can actually kind of hurt credit provision precisely because you can't do the repeat lending. I think this could happen here and it'd be something interesting for us to look at.
Beyond competition, let's talk about cooperation. So MFIs ended up entering in places where the banks were existent. What do we know about the relationship between the MFIs and the banks, and whether there's some kind of integration between banks and MFIs where they were serving different set of customers within the same places where they were?
That's one of the things that we want to understand that I don't have an answer for you yet. We think that they're serving different segments.
Could they be integrated in any way between banks and MFI? That's a question.
Integrated in what way?
Merge somehow.
Not that.
So one question I have about informality and transition from informal to formal business. Is there any way you can look into this? Because I think that could be a super important market in Peru for MFIs. And of course, it's hard to measure informality, but it would be cool to show some transition.
I agree.
Especially to access these loans. I guess you need to be like incorporated or something like that. Yeah.
Right, so we're getting at this in two ways. One is the survey that I mentioned that we're using precisely for proxies of informality at the household level for business owners. We're also seeing tax registration. So in Peru, you could actually be registered with either your personal ID or your business. So that's another outcome that we can look at as well.
We had a guest yesterday from Compartamos, and he was talking about their Peruvian business and exactly something that was surprising to me, how they go and look for customers who actually have defaulted on banks because they do have a superior lending technology. And so I guess there are potential ways that segmenting the market or the two can be complements. And I think I'd sort of never heard of that combination before, and it's interesting that you're seeing evidence already that's potentially consistent with that, so.
Yeah, I agree. I was sort of surprised too. And we want to kind of dig into this more, talk to more practitioners, kind of understand what they're doing and trying to get kind of actual estimates of how that matters for these businesses.
Are there money lenders in this setting? Like, do you know anything about, even in these deserts, the states of money lenders? And
I mean, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say yes, because they're everywhere, in developing
I mean, there is
markets,
work
but we
about how
don't see,
microfinance institutions interact with money lenders in terms of.
they may, yes, typically they're gonna crowd out the super informal markets. We don't see them to be able to tell you to what extent, right?
Even in the survey, you're not asking.
Do you know whether the same MFI enters different areas? So is
So we're
this,
talking about 10 MFIs that are driving this entire expansion, so they're entering different areas.
and do they cross subsidize it? Is it like in terms of technology, like is it important that the same MFI enters area both banked and unbanked, and there is some sort of like, cross subsidization?
That's interesting. This is something that we're trying to get at, trying to explore kind of both where they're entering and also kind of heterogeneity to try to understand more about that. I don't have a ton to tell you about it today.
Okay, thank you. So this is sort of very early stage, an RCT we're about to launch in Rwanda, joint with Giabai at the Kennedy School, Christian Lipich, who was a former country economist at the IGC, and two really fantastic graduate students, Ignacio Mara and Stephen Yarko. And I want to flag that Ignacio is going in the job market this year. So if you're looking to hire at all, but especially in development or international, please take a look at Ignacio. Okay, so at a very high level, this paper is looking at industrial policy in low and middle income countries. And so let me give you a little bit of motivation. So, industrial policy is on the rise again. Reika Juhaus and co-authors have done some sort of textual analysis that show that the number of industrial policies has sort of doubled in the past decade. But they've differed in two important ways from sort of previous waves of industrial policies. So the first, they tend to be much more outward focusing, more focused on export promotion, rather than sort of inward focusing, focused on, say, import substitution. And the second is they're often very specifically designed to alleviate market failures, right? So the particular policy we're going to look at in this context is designed to alleviate credit constraints. Okay, so we're much more sort of in the world of kind of classic economic rationales for government intervention that we might be used to. Okay. Now, despite sort of the ubiquity of these policies, we actually still don't know very much empirically about their impact in sort of three dimensions. The first is pretty straightforward, right? So we're subsidizing or treating certain firms. Do those targeted firms actually grow? What is the direct impact of some of these policies? And the reason, of course, is that firms are not targeted randomly; they're endogenously selected. And so a lot of the evidence we have has all these sort of selection problems, with a few notable exceptions. So think about, for example, Nathan Lane's work looking at industrial policy in South Korea, or Eric Verhoeven and co-authors' work on export promotion in Tunisia. But it's still a pretty thin literature, and that's really mostly on sort of just knowing the direct effect. Of course, for industrial policy, the goal is to sort of have aggregate effects in the entire economy, and so we have to think about how these policy impacts will ripple through the economy, right? We've got some evidence from both trade and macro thinking, showing that policy shocks, as well as the frictions they're designed to alleviate, that those can propagate and amplify along supply chains. And so then taking these two things together, how do we think about both the direct and indirect effects? How do we think about, optimally targeting these policies? So, perhaps not surprising, most of these export promotion policies are targeted at exporters, but it's actually not obvious that's the best way to target, right? It might be more effective to target upstream suppliers of those exporters. And that's both because it's not obvious who would have the largest direct effect, right? Who's most, say, in this case, credit constrained. It might be those smaller upstream suppliers are more credit constrained. And it's certainly not obvious when you think about kind of the indirect effects through the production network, right? It depends on the structure of the network as well as where those firms are positioned in the network. So for example, Ernest Liu's job market paper shows that in sort of hierarchical structures, market failures like credit frictions amplify upwards, making it actually more effective to target the upstream suppliers. Okay, so we're trying to make some headway on these questions empirically. in an RCT of a large industrial policy in Rwanda called the Export Credit Guarantee Fund. It's a state guaranteed loan facility for exporters and their suppliers. So a little bit more about the program and policy itself, and then I'll tell you about our design and how we're gonna try to answer those three questions. So there's lots of work showing that financial constraints may prevent firms from accessing foreign markets. We've got some survey data consistent with that as well. And to alleviate these financial constraints, it's a very common export promotion policy to provide either state subsidized loans or state guaranteed loans. And so the Export Credit Guarantee Fund is one of these guaranteed loan facilities. It's run by the Development Bank of Rwanda and the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Those are our two implementing partners. And the way this program works is a state guaranteed loan. Okay, so the guarantee covers 50 to 70% of the loans, which are offered through partner financial institutions. Okay, so the goal is that the PFIs being sort of guaranteed of this loans are able to offer loans to firms they wouldn't otherwise offer loans to, or at larger size than they would typically offer given the firm's potentially limited collateral. These are large loans. These are $50,000 to $100,000 loans. Max is $500,000, so they're large. They're not sort of micro credits. And the critical thing here is who's eligible. Okay, so it's exporters, but not just exporters, also their upstream suppliers. So for example, if you're sort of a coffee mill in Rwanda that's selling to a coffee exporter, you're eligible. Okay, we've got promising results from a predecessor program that I think I won't go into given time. And what are we doing with the RTT? We are partnering with the BRD to jointly train staff to do a randomized outreach campaign, door-to-door outreach to randomly selected firms. So this is an encouragement design. These firms are going to get 6 months of really detailed hand-holding support. So information about the program, help preparing the applications. There's lots of paperwork that has to be done, including several kind of cross different government agencies. So support with that and links to the PFIs. And in total, we'll have 500 treated firms and 1,500 control firms. The reason for the imbalance is, of course, treatment's very expensive here. Collecting data is not. So it's optimal to have a larger control group. And then finally, we measure outcomes in pretty rich administrative data and firm surveys. I'm going to boldly click on a bonus button during an 8-minute talk. See how it goes. Just to show you this data quickly. So we have a really pretty incredible admin data from Rwanda, which PSA Rwanda has great admin data for those who want to work in the country. So we've got the National Credit Registry from the Central Bank in Rwanda. We have all formal loans in the country. So we can ask, is this really expanding credit or is it just inframarginal? Customs data on export performance, corporate income tax data, data on employees and wage bills, and then critically the VAT data that shows the full network of suppliers. We'll have firm surveys, and then we're also going to have this thing I'm kind of excited about. We're going to ask bureaucrats to predict who they think is going to be most effective with this policy, to speak to kind of, can policymakers predict the winners from industrial policy? Okay, so that's the RCT. Let me tell you very quickly about the design. It's about to be launched and how we're going to answer these 3 questions on direct, indirect, and optimal targeting. So I'm going to give you first kind of the stylized supply chain, and then I'll show you kind of what the actual full, how we're thinking about this in light of the actual full production networks. So imagine a stylized, simplified chain in which there's some supplier selling to some exporter. We're going to stratify our randomization such that we have chains that look like this. So I don't know if you can see in gray, this first chain has the supplier treated, some chains will have just the exporter treated, and some both, okay, and then some pure control. And so we can look at these direct effects, what happens, on your own outcomes when you get treated. We can also get heterogeneity, is this more effective for suppliers or exporters? Indirect effects, so controlling for your own treatment status, what's the effect of being on along a supply chain where others are treated? Okay, we can do, again, more sophisticated things than this. We can compare, for example, exporters over here to exporters over here. What happens if your supplier is treated versus not? And same for the supplier, what happens when your exporter is treated versus not? And then for optimal targeting, what's best? Treating upstream, downstream, or both, we can compare sort of exports across these four chains. Now, in reality, this is not what supply chains actually look like, right? They actually look like more full production networks, much more complex. Here's the VAT data, super helpful for us. So how does this complicate our analysis? Well, the direct effects will be the same, right? Regressing outcomes on your own treatment. But for the indirect effects, we're going to use something closer to kind of a Boryasak and Whole style approach, saying given the network, the baseline network and the VAT data, We can think over 1,000 placebo randomizations. What was your expected exposure to treatment, right? And conditional on that, what was your realized exposure, both suppliers and buyers? And I'm out of time, but I'll just say, putting these two things together and to think about optimal targeting is of course going to require a structural model. We've got that missing intercept problem that was mentioned by Gerlance yesterday. And so we'll be bringing these things into a structural model on production network theory. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
What I was thinking is, trying to put a finance hat on, what would be the benefits versus the cost of this policy?
Yeah.
One way to get a sense of that would be what's the opportunity cost of funding that the government is pushing in. Rwanda borrows on international markets somewhere between 8 and 11%. And in my view, the exercise that you're doing is basically measuring direct effect, adjusting for the indirect effects, and see whether that exceeds to some extent this 8 to 11% margin.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I think the optimal targeting is thinking about more of like a closed model where, okay, where you're pulling resources from somewhere in the economy and you're putting them somewhere else. Where do you, in reality, you're right, that what's happening, coming kind of externally, being borrowed at some rate. So we could think about comparing like the rate of return to kind of the rate of borrowing. Is that what you have in mind? Yeah, it's a great idea.
What's that?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the kind of, what I would expect perhaps that the direct effect is, I don't know, lower once you adjust for all the supply chain effects.
Yeah.
You actually get this amplification. And so kind of, releasing those bottlenecks is really what creates, I don't know, I'm just.
No, you're very focused here on like the total benefit, and you're saying, think about the cost seriously. So I appreciate that.
Just to get a sense of trade-offs.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess, what is your expectation in terms of chain 4 versus chain 1 plus chain 2? Like, do you expect complementarity or substitutabilities, and why?
Yeah, so
Because that seems to be a key novelty in this project, right?
Totally.
But
No,
I'm
it's
trying to-
totally like a
I'm
lot.
trying to wrap up my mind around it, and I don't really have a prior, and so then I wonder whether you have a.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of if you take Ernest's theory very seriously, it's sort of like unambiguous that you should sort of treat upstream because these
Sure.
The complementarities, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of other work thinking about like O-ring production and quality upgrading that would think about like Daniel Shoe's work, and so we haven't quite thought about what's the unifying model for thinking about those forces. Yeah.
So have you thought about the role of trade credit? Like how prevalent is trade credit in this industry, and how are you? I mean, in your data, I didn't see the trade credit. Maybe you're surveying, but that's an important component.
No, that's a great point. That's what we're asking on the survey. It's not going to be in the yeah. So we should ask in our surveys. I mean, it's not something that I think. You're right. I was going to say it's not something upstream's going to have access to, but that may not be true because, of course, they can kind of flow through as the exporter is getting credit. That can flow through upstream. So that's where I think the surveys are going to be really helpful. I don't have a quantitative answer for you now, but we'll certainly ask about it.
There's a really cool paper by Nicolas Kunis, at Bocconi, the second Nicola Serrano, which actually points to the important role of trade credit in this industry.
Yeah.
JP with Marissa Pagianetti.
Yeah. So we'll ask about it for sure. And I shouldn't be so quick to say that I was thinking exporters have better access to it, but it really depends on how much kind of flows through the supply chain. And there is a lot of these. I mean, Amit's got some work showing the interlinking credit is quite important even between mills and farmers. It might also be between the exporter and the mill.
My question was regarding the bureaucrat survey aspect that you think. There's a recent paper by Philip Barteska that shows that moving better bureaucrats across countries can actually have an impact on export promotion policies.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if the perception of winners when you're asking these bureaucrats who is going to be better at that can actually have an impact on what you were understanding with these.
Thinking about which types of bureaucrats are kind of best at doing that prediction, or
that too, and as well what bureaucrats are better at export promotion themselves, and how.
I see. We've done a lot of work to think the only way we're getting approval for doing this is complete confidentiality and removing all of the identifying, but we could internally try to think about are there certain layers of the bureaucracy or given their individual job. It's going to be pretty small sample, so I'm just excited to hear the first average effect. We can think about kind of heterogeneity there. We might also ask economists as well, so be on the lookout for. I think I'm out of time.
Last question. Let's let Lisa.
Oh, okay.
Just conceptually, how do I think about these supply chains when there are more than one supplier upstream? I mean, and one, can you track that, and how well can you track that in the VAT data? And then two, how do I think about that?
So to the extent that it's formal, we get all of it. And so what I showed was simplified. So even my unsimplified, production network still had 2 layers. So
Yeah.
you're right, there's multiple. And so we'll have that. And eligibility, everyone is eligible if you're along the chain. Where things get a little complicated is, of course, a lot of this is agro processing, and that at some point turns informal. And you have to be a formally registered firm to have access to this. So we've thought a little bit about like, would we want to trace effects? They won't be eligible themselves, but trace effects farther upstream, but we'll be limited by formality. But we can say like 2 chains up or 1 chain up, for
But the
example.
treatment will be all the way up the chain or
All the
not
way
at all?
up that formality goes. So
Right,
yes, so
and
at
so
some point it
if
becomes
it's
informal, then no, you can't be eligible. But yes, otherwise, if you can be 2 steps up and still be eligible. Okay, thank you.
One more break. Hold the break with